On the morning of May 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn stood on a wooden scaffold in the Tower of London. She clasped her hands, knowing that within moments the executioner's sword would end her life. The crowd was silent, waiting for the fatal blow. Just 3 years earlier, she had been crowned Queen of England, a woman who had changed the course of history by capturing the heart of Henry VIII. Now she was accused of treason, adultery, and even incest, crimes that would strip her of her crown and her life. Anne Boleyn was not born into royalty, but she was no commoner either. She came from the ambitious and politically savvy Bolyn family, who ensured she received an education fit for nobility. Sent to the court of Margaret of Austria and later to France, Anne developed a sharp mind, fluency in multiple languages, and a charm that set her apart from the typical English noblewoman. By the time she returned to England in the early 1520s, she was not just a lady-in-waiting. She was a woman who could captivate and command attention. Her arrival at court coincided with the reign of Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife. Catherine had been unable to produce a male heir, and Henry, desperate for a son, was growing restless. When Anne caught his eye, it was not just her beauty that intrigued him. It was her intelligence, wit, and refusal to be just another mistress. Unlike other women, Anne rejected Henry's advances at first, making it clear she would not settle for anything less than marriage. This defiance only fueled Henry's obsession. He pursued Anne relentlessly, writing her passionate love letters, some of which still survive today. But there was one problem. Henry was already married. Divorce was not an easy option, as England was still under the authority of the Catholic Church. But Henry was determined. His desire for Anne led to one of the most controversial decisions in English history, the break from Rome and the creation of the Church of England. After years of struggle, Anne and Henry finally married in 1533, and she was crowned queen in a lavish ceremony. The following year, she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, a child who would later become one of England's greatest monarchs. But Anne's triumph was short-lived. She had promised Henry a son, and with each failed pregnancy, his patience wore thin. The very qualities that once fascinated him, her confidence, her sharp tongue, her ambition, became the very things that made her dangerous. Anne Boleyn had climbed higher than any woman before her, but the higher the climb, the greater the fall. And her fall would be swift, brutal, and orchestrated by the very men who had once supported her rise. Anne Boleyn had once been the woman for whom Henry VIII had risked everything. But by 1536, she was no longer the queen he had fought to marry. At least, not in his eyes. The once passionate love between them had turned into cold indifference, and Anne's inability to give Henry a male heir only worsened her situation. With each miscarriage, her position at court became more unstable. And as her enemies gathered, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, Anne unknowingly walked straight into a deadly trap. The first major blow came in January 1536, when Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, died. Many expected this to strengthen Anne's position, but it did the opposite. Now Henry was free of any ties to his first marriage. If he wanted to replace Anne, he could do so without the shadow of Catherine looming over him. Anne's fate was sealed when, just days later, she suffered another miscarriage. Worse still, the child she lost was a boy. It was a devastating moment. Had the baby survived, her place as queen might have been secured. But Henry saw it differently. He was convinced that his marriage to Anne had been cursed. In his mind, God had denied them a son as punishment for the way he had cast aside Catherine. And Anne, once the center of his world, was now just another obstacle standing in the way of his greatest desire, a male heir. Rumors began to spread, whispers of treason, adultery, and betrayal. Anne's enemies, eager to see her fall, painted her as an unfaithful wife who had seduced multiple men at court, including her own brother, George Bolyn. These accusations were not just shocking. They were lethal. In Tudor England, adultery by a queen was considered treason, punishable by death. And once Henry was convinced of Anne's guilt, nothing would stop her downfall. By May 2nd, 1536, the trap was set. Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London, the very place where she had once celebrated her coronation. Now she was a prisoner, accused of crimes so outrageous that even her enemies struggled to believe them, but belief didn't matter. What mattered was that Henry wanted her gone, and once the king had made up his mind, there was no escape. Anne Boleyn's arrest sent shockwaves through England. The Queen of England, once untouchable, was now a prisoner accused of treason, adultery, and incest alongside her. Several men were arrested. On May 15th, 1536, Anne was sentenced to death. She was to be burned at the stake or, if the king showed mercy, beheaded. Henry, in a rare moment of supposed kindness, chose the latter. But not just any execution. Anne's fate was to be sealed with the blade of a skilled French swordsman, rather than the clumsy axe used for common executions. The morning of May 19th, 1536, was eerily quiet. Anne, dressed in a simple grey gown, walked to the scaffold within the Tower of London. Unlike the usual public executions at Tower Hill, Anne's beheading was to be a private affair, witnessed only by a select group of nobles and soldiers. Despite everything, she carried herself with dignity. There was no pleading, no hysteria, just a woman who knew her fate and accepted it. Before kneeling, Anne addressed the crowd. She did not proclaim her innocence or curse her enemies. Instead, she spoke carefully, praising the king and asking for prayers. "Good Christian people," she said, "I am come hither to die, according to the law, for my offenses against the king's grace." Whether she truly believed she was guilty or simply wished to protect her daughter Elizabeth from further disgrace, no one can say. She knelt on the scaffold, her hands folded in prayer. The executioner, a skilled swordsman from France, was brought in for this very purpose. Unlike the usual clumsy axe, which often required multiple blows, the sword would ensure a swift, clean death. Anne's ladies-in-waiting stood nearby, their faces pale as they watched the queen prepare for her final moments. The executioner, trained in the art of deception, called out to his assistant for his sword. As Anne instinctively turned her head, unaware that the weapon was already in the executioner's hands, the blade came down in one swift motion. In an instant, Anne Boleyn, the woman who had changed England forever, was gone.